Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Americans for Peace Now webinar. I'm Hadar Susskind. I'm the president and CEO of Americans for Peace Now. In a moment, I will introduce our fabulous guest. But as you know, it takes a minute or two for everyone to get into the Zoom. So this is the part where I partake in the time-honored Washington tradition of filibustering. So I will smile and talk for another minute. Luckily for you, I won't read any entire books at you because we don't have to wait for that long. We'll just give it a moment or two. As we are getting started, I'll remind everybody how these events work. If you would like to ask a question, I urge you to please use the Q&A function at the bottom, not raising your hands, not anything else. You can type your questions into the Q&A. We will get to as many of them as we possibly can. Please, as always, try to keep them short and keep them related to the content of our conversation. Because of course there are lots of questions and lots of things, but you know we've got a focus and a reason for coming here today. So again, please use the Q&A button. We would love to get questions from you. I remind everyone that this is being recorded and we will share the recording afterward if you can't stay for the whole time, if you want to share it with other people, etc. So once again, as we kick it off, thank you for joining us. I'm Hadar Susskind. I'm the president and CEO of Americans for Peace Now. I am joined today for this very timely conversation by my friend Rebecca Abou-Chedid. Hello, Rebecca. I will give you all the short version of Rebecca's very long and impressive resume. She's on the board of the IMEU Policy Project, of Anera, of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and Seed for Change. For 5 years, she was co-chair of the board of directors of Just Vision, another important partner of ours. She previously worked both at the U.S. Department of Justice and was national political director for the Arab American Institute. She is a close collaborator and a thought partner and somebody I am always happy to be with. So hi, Rebecca, how are you?
Hi, Hadar. Thanks for having me.
Good. Thanks for joining us. So we are here today to talk about what's really the topic of the week. I think for us, it's pretty much always the topic, but specifically, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu is here. He has been in DC for a few days now, today meeting with President Biden and Vice President Harris. But yesterday, in many ways, was really kind of the epicenter of the event. Yesterday, of course, he spoke before a joint session of Congress. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative here for a minute or two and just sort of tell you what we were up to yesterday, so everyone can understand the framing of what my experience was yesterday, and then Rebecca and I will dig into this. You know, for many weeks, hopefully all of you have seen, since we knew that Netanyahu was coming to town, we were very clear that literally our little slogan is Netanyahu is not welcome here. We urged members of Congress to skip the speech, not to go, not to participate in that. And then yesterday, we joined, I'm going to go with, for the moment, alongside, because there were a lot of different people outside the Capitol yesterday and a lot of different protests. We took part in a few events, starting off with something that was organized by our colleagues at Trua, which was actually a Shacharit morning prayer service that then turned into a call to end the war, to bring home the hostages, to move past conflict and to peace. Some of you I know were there. Was glad to see you. Hope maybe you watched it online. We also co-sponsored and participated in an event with our colleagues from Unacceptable, where I spoke along with others. And again, you know, talked about the fact that, you know, Netanyahu is here claiming to speak in the voice of all Israelis, when in fact that's clearly not the case. And so many of the things that he said yesterday during his speech to Congress, and we'll get to that, you know, I think, to be perfectly honest, would have been mocked and ridiculed by Israeli audiences who know better than at least so many Republican members of Congress. And then during the speech yesterday, because we had encouraged members not to participate, we partnered with a range of organizations, with Center for American Progress, Center for International Policy, Win Without War, and others, to come together and host an event where, instead of listening to Netanyahu and, you know, his rehearsed lines and listening to him bask in the applause for the Israeli soldiers and others who were there with him, we gathered with members of Congress and with people who are really peacemakers, people who are working toward these efforts, with Aziz Abu Sara, a Palestinian and Maoz Inon, an Israeli who some of you may have been on our webinar with them, who've been working together for peace with our colleague Nadav Weinman from Breaking the Silence, and with so many others. And, we spent that time talking about what can we, both we as organizations, we as leaders here in the US, but also members of Congress, what can we actually do to get past not just this immediate moment of conflict, but this whole frame of conflict? How can we move from what has been Netanyahu's refrain of "we will just continue to live by the sword" into a better future? So, apologies for my rambling. What we want to talk about now is really, what did this visit from Netanyahu, the speech before Congress, the White House meetings, all the rest of it, the protests outside, of which there were, as I said, both Israelis and Jewish Americans, but obviously many, many Arab and Muslim Americans and many others, with an array of different meanings and messages. So, how is this playing? What does this look like? What does it mean for US-Israel politics? What does it mean for the American Jewish community, the Arab American community, and also Rebecca's adorable dog, which I think is hiding just off screen, so we might as well just show him, because Rebecca has an adorable little dog. They've seen my dog on webinars before, but it's been in my lap. So with that, Rebecca, why don't you kind of kick us off a little bit and tell us, share some thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Hadar. Look, I mean, one of the things that I thought was so interesting watching a bunch, particularly so many Democrats kind of standing up and applauding Netanyahu, who for me is really just the Israeli version of Donald Trump, was that he came to Washington and got a reception that he never could have gotten in Israel, right? So the way that people responded to this speech totally ignored the fact that for months, and not just since October, but for months even pre-October, there were thousands and thousands of Israelis in the streets calling for this man to resign, saying that he is a threat to Israeli democracy, and now more recently asking for a ceasefire so that the hostages can come home. I cannot imagine what it would have felt like to be the family of a hostage member, watching American members of Congress who talk about wanting to bring home the hostages and to end this genocide in Gaza, standing up and applauding him when he was lying. I mean, he lied about so many things, and we'll kind of talk through those. But really, kind of as an overarching response, that was my first response, just how strange it was to kind of watch that. And I know that, many of, as you said, that there were many members who boycotted. And then there was one sole member who sat there silently, the only Palestinian member of Congress, Rashida Tlaib, on her birthday. And I think clearly
That's a terrible way to celebrate
your birthday. But I think to make clear that, like, I think she wanted to speak for, and her guest was Hani Mathoun, who has lost over 100 members of his family, including his brother and his nieces and nephews. But I think her point in being there was so that he had to see her face, and so that the thing that we have been so upset about as a community for the past 9 months is just how invisible Palestinians have been in the US kind of conversation and debate over not just what's happening in Gaza right now, but the entire conflict. And for decades, Palestinians have been, it's so strange to say, but have been absent from the conversation happen to their lives. And I think having Rashida there was really important, as difficult as it must have been to be there. I think it was really important. So, that was my first my first kind of reaction was just that he came there because he can't get that reception in Israel. People he's too well known in Israel. And, even now they're said he's the worst leader that the state of Israel has had. And so he would never have been able to get a reception like that. And so he came here to gaslight the US Congress and the US people about what's going on right now. I also think that you didn't hear, we all know what it sounds like when you hear a leader who's trying to find peace. That's not what we heard yesterday. We didn't hear a leader who, as Secretary Blinken said, is on the 10-yard line of a ceasefire. We didn't hear any plan for how to end this conflict, how to bring the hostages home. We didn't hear any plan for how to actually come up with a peace deal afterwards, because we all know that there is no military solution to this conflict. In the end, Palestinians and Israelis are going to be sharing this land. They're going to be living side by side. And I thought it was really so interesting, the moment where he acknowledged a Bedouin soldier. and really kind of made it clear to everybody that he was Muslim. And that seemed important to Netanyahu to kind of say that we have a Muslim fighting for the state of Israel. And what it said to me was, oh, which is not what I think he meant, not that message I think he meant for, which is that like, oh, so I guess there's no kind of ingrained Muslim animus towards the Jewish people that you're always trying to convince us, that there is no kind of inbred anti-Semitism here, that people in the end might be able to actually live side by side and fight for each other's security if we were in a different situation than the one that we are stuck in right now, in large part because of leaders like him. So, all I heard was total victory. And I think his version of total victory is total annihilation of the people in Gaza. And that is not going to be a victory, and that's not going to bring security to the state of Israel. And there've been a lot of fact checks on there. He lied about a lot of things, and I think we'll have a chance to talk about them. Like he was not honest about the number of trucks that have made it into Gaza. He was not honest. And we heard from the beginning of this conflict, we have heard Israeli leaders and his, members of his cabinet say exactly what they were going to do and exactly what they did, which is a total ban on food and water getting into Gaza. And so, during different times, there has been increases up and down, but in general, it has been a strategy not to allow food and water and other humanitarian assistance into Gaza. And so, I don't think phones what's going on, that it's going to convince anyone to say that there's 3,000 calories a day making their way into Gaza. And the only reason that Palestinians are hungry is because Hamas is stealing it. I just don't think that's credible.
He didn't. It was interesting because I was watching again this morning. Again, I didn't watch the speech in real time, right? I was at the counter event. I was watching this morning, and he talked about those numbers, and he said that's enough for 3,000 calories for every man, woman, and child in Gaza. He didn't say 3,000 a day. And so I actually was just wondering, and I don't know the answer.
Maybe over 9 months? I don't know.
Right. I don't know the answer of whether he actually literally meant that, which is totally conceivable, that amount of food that, Israel has allowed in, like maybe that number is true and he didn't say a day, or maybe he, like many other things, was anywhere from twisting, misrepresenting, or lying. I think I wrote a piece also this morning about the many different things. I mean, his talk about how he was doing everything possible to bring the hostages home, and his greatest commitment was bring the hostages home, when 7 members of hostage families got arrested. Yeah, because they stood up. The only reason they went, I spent a lot of time with them, they stood up with signs that said, "Seal the deal now," or with shirts, which, I was at an event with them the night before and with other hostage families that day. Seal the deal explicitly, and unfortunately, it's not great messaging, frankly, because it doesn't say this, but they said it when they speak. They mean end the war and bring the hostages home. And so they were willing to get arrested for that. And he was standing up there claiming, and like you said, in a claim that no one in Israel would give any credence to, that he's doing everything he can to bring the hostages home.
Yeah, I mean, look, it should be shocking to American members of Congress, many of whom, thanks to organizations like yours, met with a lot of these hostage families. But it should be shocking to people that hostage families have to fly from Israel to the United States to get the attention of the Prime Minister of Israel. And that's what they had to do. I mean, they had to, like, that is shocking to me. I mean, I can't imagine that if something like that were to happen in the United States and the American president just ignored the families of people going through this, I just think that should be completely unacceptable. I mean, if nothing else, that should have meant he never got an invitation to speak to a joint session of Congress.
So one of the things that I thought was fascinating, and Rebecca, I know you remember last time he was here also, there were organizing efforts to tell members of Congress not to go. Many of them didn't. Last time actually was more explicitly partisan, because of course he was invited by the Republican speaker without the veneer of bipartisanship that this one brought, because Schumer and Jeffries signed on. But according to reports, about half of the Democrats skipped the speech. About half went, but both House and Senate members. It's really just about 50%. And that is shocking. And the fact that, Netanyahu has always presented himself in Israel as, I'm the person who can manage America. I'm the one who can always build bipartisan support. I know how to do American politics. I think he thinks because when he speaks in English, he pronounces Israel like he's from Kentucky, says Israel, which I always think is very weird. It's my little pet peeve. But, the fact that he has so broken what, for good or for bad, and people have different opinions on this, obviously, but what has for many years been largely bipartisan support, even, with tweaks around the edges, but he's completely broken that. And I think the state of the US-Israel relationship today is very different than it's ever been.
Yeah, look, I think he's a particularly, bad leader for this moment. He's not a courageous leader. He's, I will let the Israeli courts, if they ever get the chance to actually adjudicate it, likely a criminal, like he's corrupt. And so there's also intertwined in everything that he's doing is just like Trump, again, a very personal effort to keep himself out of courts and out of prison. And so that's what's when that's what's driving your leader, you know that you're in a bad place. But I also think
he's only been indicted 3 times to Trump's 34.
But I also think just like America's problem is not Trump alone, it's Trumpism. If you removed Netanyahu, that wouldn't solve a lot of the problems. And so I think the same members of the caucus who didn't attend his speech are the same members that you've seen starting to kind of speak out. And what they're speaking out against is what looks now for all to see is a permanent occupation, is an apartheid system, is right. Like nobody could credit, people still talk about 2 states in the US without acknowledging that the Israeli Knesset voted to say there will not be a Palestinian state. And the Israeli prime minister keeps saying there will not be a Palestinian state. And so we keep holding on to this because it's the only thing that we can kind of conceive of in this moment, ignoring kind of what's on the ground. And I think that that's really dangerous. And I also think that the way that the United States, like elected officials in the US have related to Israel is as if Israel doesn't have internal politics the way that the United States has internal politics. And so one thing that I remember from the last time Netanyahu came was a friend who's now back in Israel and was B'Tselem's US director at the time, Uri Zaki. He said to me, I don't understand why your Democrats, like why liberal Democrats in the United States, who say that they love Israel don't understand what they're doing to the Israeli left when they welcome. Remembered that. And it's a really important point to me that we have not on the American left spent enough time thinking about how we can support and make common cause with the left in Israel. And because we haven't done that, we've actually harmed them over years.
I think it's a really good point. And, we talk about the US-Israel relationship. We talk about what American politicians, whichever ones or party we're talking about, what they think of Israel. And again, it's exceedingly unsophisticated. There's a very polite way I can think about it. Israel has, as we all know, very intense domestic politics. And right now, 72% of Israelis want Netanyahu to resign immediately. All these other things. So he, of course, does a good job of presenting himself as, he is Israel, he speaks for Israel, but we all need to do a better job of not only understanding the difference ourselves, which I think probably the folks on this Zoom do, but helping our elected officials understand that. And one other thing I want to pick up from what you said, the conversation about 2-state solution. So again, another thing that Netanyahu was very happy to tout is this is the 4th time he's spoken to a joint session of Congress, more than any other world leader ever, more than Winston Churchill, so he's very excited. In previous times, he talked about a 2-state solution. He claimed support for a 2-state solution. Now, lots of people could obviously correctly argue that he never meant it. But the fact is, he used to say that. That used to be his policy and the policy of the state of Israel, even under Likud and specifically his leadership. And like you said, it is explicitly not anymore. This government that came into power at the beginning of 2023 has in their coalition agreement plans for annexation. It has in its coalition agreement statements that say, we will not allow a Palestinian state. And like you said, they just had this Knesset vote, which was, one more horrific statement, including the fact that Benny Gantz and his party voted for it. So, everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, but everybody here, most likely, and, was waiting for new elections, calling for new elections. The assumption among most people, because of the polling, is that Benny Gantz will be the next prime minister. And of course, will lead a much, a center-left government as opposed to a far-right government. But it's worth noting that he and his party voted for this. And so, just continuing on, like you were saying, of like, oh, this is how we relate to Israel, as if that doesn't change, is frankly a failure on the part of American politics.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that I agree with that. And then I think one other point that it's important to dig into, especially because of the response that we're seeing today from U.S. protests. I mean, you mentioned that you were out there, and there were clearly, bad actors out there. Like there were clearly, and I don't know who these people were. Like I don't know who's burning an American flag, which is not something, I condone, but it's protected free speech. I don't know who was out there. I don't know if they were in good faith. I don't know if they were meant to, I don't know if just 9 months into this, people have started to just kind of snap and are so frustrated they don't know how to be productive anymore. But it's really important to me, and I cannot believe that a foreign leader would come and criticize American protesters, Americans exercising their First Amendment rights, say that they're paid by Iran, call them Iran's useful idiots, and then get a standing ovation from members of Congress. Like, those are your constituents. And this is their right, and that's what the United States is about. And it's just like, I'm not asking anybody to condone these, like this small number of people who, said whatever they said. Like, I haven't actually seen it, but I've just heard about it. I
saw it, and I'll tell you a little in a minute.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to hear it. But the point being that there were also bad actors during the BLM protests. And as collectively, we didn't allow ourselves to say this delegitimizes the whole movement, that this characterizes the whole movement. And we didn't allow ourselves to take our eyes off the ball, which was that George Floyd was murdered and that we have a problem with police brutality in the United States. And I think similarly, we have to hold our friends and our opponents accountable for the same thing, which is the same standard, which is to say we should not allow. I mean, I don't want the protests that you organized to be ignored. I don't want, right? Like there's similarly to not seeing the complexities in Israel. There are also many people who don't see the nuances within the Jewish community here in the United States and think, right, that like there's the Jewish
and in the Arab American community.
Yeah, so like there's the Jewish community on one side and the Arab American community on the other side, ignoring the fact that for 9 months there have been protests across this country that have been overwhelmingly peaceful and that have included both Jewish and Arab Americans within that coalition.
Yeah.
And I think that's just really important.
It is. And I'll tell you, yesterday was interesting. So again, like I said, I started out the day at something organized by Trua. It was rabbis. There were, 100 people wearing kippot and talit and literally doing morning prayer in Hebrew. So it was very obviously, visibly Jewish. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of protesters, walking by in groups. A lot just walked by. That was, the most common was like, okay, they looked and they kept going, fine. There were a few who stopped and engaged in really good, interesting conversations. People who had, because again, everyone's looking at everyone else's side. So folks are walking by with their Palestinian flags and Free Palestine signs. And, there were some people who yelled Free Palestine when they saw the Jews. And then there were other people who were like, wait, no, look at what their signs say. Look at what they're saying. And we had some really interesting conversations. And
I think that's okay. Like that's the point of being out there, is to have the chance to have conversation.
For sure. We had a little, I experienced what I would call a small scuffle. There was the protest that was set up by Unacceptable. They put sort of around the area they had to protest for probably 100 Israeli flags up. And they put them up interspersed with the yellow flags representing the hostages and the hostage families. But I'm pretty confident that 99% of the people who walked by didn't know that about the yellow flags.
Mhm.
Right? Anybody who wasn't there for that protest, anyone who's not part of, that movement, and people came by, said their things. It was fine. At one point, a young woman tore down one of the Israeli flags, kind of, I say violently. I mean, she didn't assault anyone, but she, kind of ripped it down, and then one of the Israeli men who was part of the unacceptable group grabbed it back, and the two of them started pulling, and immediately a crowd came on both sides,
Yeah.
and people were screaming and people were yelling, and I and a couple of others like kind of got in the middle, and there were police there. There was no punches, no violence, but it was very tense. That
Yeah.
was kind of the worst thing, so to speak, I saw in the morning. Again, along with a lot of like totally good conversations and engagement. I will say, I'm in the afternoon walking back after the congressional meeting. We walked by Union Station, which is where the big
Yeah, that's where.
that's where the quote bad protest, like the bad actions happened. Um, I got a little, just a little whiff of the tear gas that had been used. We were far enough away that we just kind of got a little cough and a little runny nose. But you could see on the fountain at Union Station there, completely, graffitied and defaced. It said in big letters, Hamas is coming. You could see many things had been burned. So again, I don't think that does not reflect the many people who I had conversations with throughout the day, but it was
Or
part
the
of
9 months of protests that we've seen.
more than 9 months of
Right?
protests.
Like,
Yeah. But it
yeah.
was definitely, but it happened. And, and the police response, I don't know I was not in that. So I don't know kind of how it escalated. But I mean, I saw the 200 riot police in full gear pushing toward the crowd. And, in whatever country, we know how that goes.
Yeah.
So it was a difficult part of yesterday. Like, it's not, this issue is hard for all of us, and
Yeah.
how to respond to it is hard. That's not the right answer. But it was difficult. I want to ask you, and I want to like put a period and move, because it's not in response to that. I spent most of my day with Jewish Americans, with Israelis, talking to people, with Palestinians also. And I've been spending most of my day talking to people within my community about how this visit is being seen, how these meetings and all the things are being seen. What is your takeaway on the kind of 30,000 foot of like, and again, it's a mass generalization, but like, how is the Arab American community, its leaders, its organizations, seeing and responding to the engagement of Netanyahu here this week?
Well, you're asking about like organizationally?
Yeah, I mean, it was a poor question. Apologies. Like,
No, it's okay.
I look at what the American Jewish community is doing. There are those leaders who chose to go meet with Netanyahu. There are people obviously, cheering him on, but there are many of us. It's not, happily, it's not just APN saying like, no, this is not right. What
Yeah.
he's saying isn't true. What are you seeing in that? How's the Arab American community looking at, I would say, our own American political leaders and how they're relating to Netanyahu?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot of effort similar to yours, which was to ask people not to attend, to kind of send that message that the invitation itself was the wrong thing to do and was offensive. And a lot of efforts to kind of have conversations, because what I can say again is just that the community has felt invisible during so much of this, right? So a lot of like the conversations that we've had with our leaders, with members of Congress, with the administration, is an effort to say, we know you can see the full humanity of the Israeli people in the way that you talk about the hostages. Why can't you see the full humanity of Palestinian people, right? Like, why is the only answer to a Palestinian, when a senator calls a Palestinian constituent, a Palestinian American constituent who has lost 70 family members, why is the only thing that they can think of to say to her is, well, Trump would be worse? Like that's not an answer. Like, that's not an answer that shows that her family has as much value, right, as anybody else's family. And that's been, deeply upsetting to kind of see from our own leaders. And I'll say, look, I mean, I won't be too partisan here, but I am a Democrat, and you know, a lot of President Biden's campaign for president was about his decency and his empathy, and his ability to kind of connect. And that's who he has been as a public figure his entire, unfortunately, because of the great loss that he suffered. But it's been really shocking and really jarring to us that ability seems to have just been turned off. Like, that empathy has just seems to have been turned off when it comes to the loss of Palestinian life in Gaza. And that has been surprising, frankly, to see, and really disheartening to see. And so, you know, it's something that I think we've really struggled with the last 9 months, and something I know Rashida, as the only Palestinian in Congress, has really struggled with. Like, how do you know, with all of the hateful things that have been said in Congress in the last 9 months, the only member who has been formally censured is the one Palestinian member of Congress. So, you know, that's just been a hard, you know, and so there are friends of mine who have, you know, as everybody now is part of many chat groups, right? And so you'll be in a chat group where a friend will tell me, I lost 15 members of my family last night, and I'm meeting with my senator this afternoon, right? So it's like people who don't even have time to absorb the loss of members of their family, and are still just like doing whatever they can from an advocacy perspective to try to make a difference. And that's been the existence of their American and Muslim communities the last 9 months.
Yeah, I mean, even just yesterday seeing, you know, you said Congresswoman Tlaib brought a guest who lost many family members in Gaza, I presume. You know, many of the members of Congress brought hostage families as guests, or you know, Israelis who had lost family members. And even in the event we did in the afternoon with Aziz and Moaz, you know, they started off talking about how they built their relationship and about empathy. And, you know, I'm not gonna spend all the time telling their story, but the quick version is, you know, Aziz lost his brother, who was said taken and tortured and ultimately killed by the Israeli military 25 years ago. Moaz lost both of his parents on October 7th. And on, I think it was the 8th or the 9th, Aziz reached out to Moaz, who they did not really know each other, said they were, you know, Facebook friends, but not really friends in real life. He sent him a Facebook message, you know, expressing his sorrow and his empathy. And he said, I didn't expect him to answer me. I figured he'd be, you know, dealing with his own grief, with his own trauma. And Moaz immediately reached out to him and said, yes, you know, the only path forward is understanding each other's pain and empathy, and finding a way to use this to move past, you know, constant conflict. And the way that they talk about it, and I've been with them a number of times in the last, you know, bunch of months, and many of you who are with us today probably were on the webinar that we did it with them, but it's shocking to me how rare that is, to actually talk about empathy and to talk about understanding each other's pain and understanding the loss of lives between Israelis and Palestinians. And in the American political system, we're so used to people expressing very rightly their, you know, sorrow and horror and sadness at the loss of Israeli lives. And it's true that you basically never hear that about Palestinian lives.
And look, the reason that empathy is important and humanizing people is important is because if Palestinians had not been dehumanized in this country for decades, there is just absolutely no way this would have continued this long. There's just no way. We would never accept it. We would collectively we would never accept it if we fully absorbed. I mean, I've never even heard the president or any of his senior advisors talk about Palestinian Americans who are stuck in Gaza. Right? I've never heard it. Like, we know that there are American hostages, but we don't think about the fact that there are Palestinian Americans who are stuck in Gaza who couldn't get out, people who were, like, you know, trying to get to Rafah and trying to get out, and they have to pay $5,000 and and you know, a lot of these people like are trying to reach out to the State Department and weren't getting any help. And while all of the attention has been on Gaza, it's also been the most deadly year in the West Bank, right? So, I mean, I was introduced to a family, a Palestinian family based in Georgia whose mother was arrested. She was arrested because of Facebook posts. She's an American citizen. And for weeks, we tried to get that. We were pushing every day for weeks. And the answer from the state, we don't know. We don't have any information. We don't have an answer. We have no idea. We're trying. I cannot imagine that would be good enough as an answer for, you know, for other American citizens in other countries. I just don't understand why that's good enough. And I really think that, I mean, so what's amazing about Aziz and Muaz isn't just that, like, empathy is not important for the sake of like feeling good or like the kumbaya moment. It's not, you know, like there were so many, I think, during the Oslo years, like conversation groups, discussion groups between Israelis and Palestinians, and those have since, I think, people kind of look at them and deride them. But the point of them was not just so that individual people can like become friends and get to know each other, or like it was so that if you actually humanize these other people, you would never allow this level of violence against them in this collective way. You would never allow a 2,000-pound bomb to be dropped in what is supposed to be a safe zone where children are playing soccer. You know, like I think that that's what's really important about it too. It's not just about getting members of Congress to say like the nice words. Those are important, but it's because the policy should flow from that.
Yeah.
And I'm glad we have empathy for Israelis. I have it too. And I want us to maintain it. I just want people's I just want human beings to be deserving of it, regardless of, you know, where they are living, where they were born, or who they pray to.
Yeah. Absolutely. So with that, I want to go back to the policy discussion a little bit. Actually, one of the things Netanyahu said that, you know, got big applause yesterday. I mean, as you said rightly, he didn't present any plan for, you know, as people often talk about, you know, the day after, right? What's the plan? How is this going to work? He did have some line, and I'm paraphrasing here, about, you know, a demilitarized Gaza ruled by Palestinians, which that really was surprising to hear him say, but, you know, Palestinians who don't want to see Israel's destruction, from what he said, right? So not Hamas, I believe, is the implication there. I mean, again, it's clear.
But with Israel maintaining some kind of security presence.
Right. He wasn't necessarily clear about that yesterday, but he's always said that. Yeah. I mean, I'm not, you feel free to talk about what you think of his non-plan if you'd like, but I think that's probably pretty clear. I guess one of the questions I'm interested about is, like, when we start thinking about what are the policy things, and we did this in our conversation with the members of Congress yesterday, like, what are the actual policy things that the United States could do? And what are the things that you would want to see? You know, we're talking about Congress taking actions, because again, we know, you know, there's the administration can do certain things, Congress. What are some of the things that you would actually want to see them taking up? You know, once we assume, if we assume that empathy and say, okay, now we're ready for action, where does it go?
Yeah. So I think for me, if I got to kind of write the letter that they all signed off, we would, until there is a ceasefire, we would, and it's now the administration is now willing to say, I mean, in the beginning, they said, oh, well, Hamas is the one like stopping this. They are now willing to say that Netanyahu keeps moving the goalposts on a ceasefire. We should stop offensive weapons to Israel, period. Our policy is a ceasefire. And so if our policy is a ceasefire, we should not be giving offensive weapons to a party that is dropping them on civilian populations. And we should, and by the way, we saw what it looked like when the administration was very serious for that brief moment after the World Central Kitchen bombing. There was, I think it was clear to Netanyahu and others in Israel that the United States was very serious about this being a problem. It shouldn't have taken that, by the way, but that was a moment, right? I mean, Jose Andres is a beloved figure, and people really responded to what happened to his workers, as they should have, but it shouldn't have gotten there. But we need to surge food and aid to the people of Gaza. I mean, I can tell you statistics, as you mentioned, I'm on the board of Anera, but I got this morning from our Palestine country director, and I'm not speaking on behalf of Anera, obviously, but in the first 15 days of July, there were 1,288 trucks. So that's about 86 a day. In June, the average was 76 a day. In May, it was 94 a day. That is just nowhere near what's needed. We had the average before October was 500 a day. And so we need massive amounts of food and aid. And look, I mean, we built that pier and the pier never worked, and we, had to dismantle the pier. It's like, sadly, the perfect metaphor for our policy, which is we say that we believe in things, but we're just not willing to actually see it all the way through. So if we think that when Russia uses food as a weapon of war, that's a war crime and that's deplorable, we cannot allow our allies to do it either. And if we continue to allow them, we are complicit in that. And so those two things to me are the easy and the obvious ones, which is we need to end offensive military aid, and we need to surge food and medical supplies immediately. And then I think, like, for the long term, we need to get really serious. We can't just, like, again, the mantra of like 2 states, 2 states, 2 states is just not going to cut it. Like, we know what people will say during a campaign season. That's not what we're talking about. We really need to get, and if it's get our European allies together, if it's get the, and I hate the term moderate Arab states, because all we mean when we say that is states who are willing to sit down with Israel. That's it. They're not, in no other way are they moderate Arab states. But we need to get those Gulf states. We need to invest the region in something that is real about what comes next. Because again, Israelis and Palestinians are going to be living together in that land. That's it. That is what this looks like. And we need to get really serious about that. And I haven't seen that to date. But if you're asking kind of what I would want to see, that's what I would want to see.
I think that some of those particular pieces that you were talking about, of course, are things we have been advocating for, among others. And it's really interesting because everything you just said, I think, certainly taking the beginning points, the no offensive weapons and the need to surge aid, that's just glaringly obvious to me that we should be doing those, not just because I think those are the right thing, but because those are consistent with our policies. Those are consistent with our laws, right? And the problem that we run up against is the United States, when it is dealing with Israel, and it deals with each country differently, so I'm not comparing it to everything, but doesn't apply those things equally. And we have these conversations with people, both, I'll say, for me, within the Jewish community and others, but also folks in Congress and folks in the administration. We 3.5, getting close to 4 years ago now, came out talking about conditioning aid, right? And so stopping offensive weapons, you could do it lots of different ways, but it also falls under the category of conditioning aid, right? You're using our aid for things that are opposed to our policies, opposed to our values. You can't do that. We're not going to give it to you. And when we did that, when we came out with that, it was not the policy. There'd never been a bill in Congress to do that. It was not the policy. I'm sure there were some folks who agreed with it, but it was not the stated policy of any members of Congress. And people just looked at us like, you're insane. You can't do that. And now, like you said, it has, I mean, for horrible reasons, but it has happened to some extent, the concept of conditioning aid, and not enough, but it is certainly a very mainstream part of the political conversation right now. And I think that so much of what we as an organization and as a community and all of us as allies need to do is help push our elected officials past the, oh, well, that's how we do it. Or like, oh, that's the safe piece to do, and say in this particular moment of crisis, but also in this crisis situation of, like you said, seemingly endless occupation, right? It's not just about the 9 months and, October 7th and the war in Congress and the war in Gaza. It's this whole issue is breaking out of what is simple, easy, accepted, and following things that are not radical, but just actually our laws, and applying them across the board so that they do meet with our policies and our values.
Yeah, and look, and also just being honest about the fact that, like, I understand why Netanyahu would come here and talk about Iran. I understand that. I mean, that's where, again, like China and Iran are where we have bipartisan consensus on foreign policy in the US. And so I understand why that would be smart from his perspective. But the fact is that the threat to Israel is the occupation. The existential threat to Israel is not Iran. It is the occupation. And for a bunch of American elected officials who are always kind of professing their love for Israel, that's a message that they haven't kind of loved Israel enough to send very honestly, to say you cannot continue this.
Sorry for that, but I'll just interject there. Even the ones who claim they stand very clearly for two states, right? I mean, you've got a bunch of them who their love of Israel is just whatever Netanyahu says, but even those for whom they stand resolutely by the idea of two states seem to often forget that one of those states is Palestine, right? That, like, two states is not Israel and Jordan, two states is not Israel and Sweden, Uruguay, right? It's Palestine, and to do that, it means you have to end the occupation. Sorry, I can't help myself.
No, I mean, that's where I just think, and look, I mean, this is not today's topic, but I think two states is like one version of what could work. You could also have like a confederation that has two states of one big, like there's different, that we are all in agreement that the human beings living from the river to the sea deserve equal rights and freedom and dignity, regardless of their religion. That's it. And if you agree on that, and if that's the bedrock, and if all negotiations flow from that agreement, then you can come up with different versions. And what do you figure out? And, do the settlers stay, but they're citizens of Israel? And like, you can figure things out that solve the problem. The problem is not the logistics of where you draw the line and the settlers. And that's not the problem. The problem is this core, like, inability to mean it when we say that Palestinians deserve freedom and equal dignity. And I say that, I mean, that's been the core, I think, from the beginning of the conflict, but through now. And until that changes, there will not be a solution. Because if you're trying to kind of come up with some solution that draws lines of blah, 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 like, but without acknowledging the humanity and the dignity of half of the people in the conflict, then clearly you're not going to, like, if they're invisible to you and you don't hear them and they're not an equal part of the conversation, like, you're not going to solve the conflict between Palestine and Israel by talking to the Saudis. You're just not.
That's called managing the conflict, right? I mean,
and that's what we've done over decades, but
that's what Netanyahu has pushed.
Yeah. I mean, we've managed the conflict for decades. And I guess what is the most frustrating to me is I would like people to see the equal dignity of both peoples. But even if you don't, and all you care about is the Israeli people, you're not doing them a favor either.
Perfect. So I want to remind everyone, if you've got questions, please use the Q&A function. And with that, I'm going to ask one of them. Rebecca, well, I'm going to ask you, maybe I'll answer it too, but I assume this is to you. The question is actually a pretty simple one. Is a viable sovereign Palestinian state still possible? I say simple,
Yeah, simple, short.
Short question, I guess, is more accurate. It's not really simple, but
look, anything's possible, right? Like, it's not a question of like, can we figure out how to do it? Is the political will there? And again, for me, like, I don't know that it needs to be like that we remove all the settlers and we move all these people and we like, and we put a border. It could be something else. It could be, as I said, like two states, like we have 50 states. It could be two states in one country in a joint, like it could look different ways. But is something where Palestinians have their civil and, political and human rights still possible? Yes. And can that be separated from the Israeli, polity? Yes. So the question to me is not whether we would figure it out. But what do you think?
Yeah, I lost you there for a second. I don't know if it was you or me, but I got that. Look, I mean, people ask me this often, right? Especially every time there's an announcement of, Israel has, taken X number of dunams as state lands and, legalized 1 million new settlements and all of these horrible things that, as you said, happened more this year than any year in
Yeah.
history, as, the eyes of the world have been focused more on Gaza. And there are lots of people I hear from who say, oh, there's just like, we missed it. It's done. Which, first of all, I'm not sure what their conclusion is there. Like, so does that mean we're just supposed to say, okay? Or like, I don't know what they think we're supposed to do with that. But I also absolutely don't think that's true. And it really is because of what you were saying. The settlements, horrible as they are a challenge. They are not something insurmountable. And all of those other things, again, where the line is, what the configuration is politically as well as geographically, all of those things can be solved with the political will. And,
I'll also say though that I don't have so I'm not going to live in whatever configuration there is. So it's also like not my decision to make. But my family is from Lebanon, and my grandmother grew up in a neighborhood that was Jewish in Beirut, and almost like overnight that community, was emptied out almost completely. And in my opinion, we lost a lot when we lost our Jewish community. Like there is still a very small Jewish community, and they've rebuilt the historic synagogue in Beirut. And right now, Lebanon still, we have problems like any country, but like I'm very proud of the fact that we have 17 different religions living more or less with each other in that country. And so to me, it's also just not impossible to imagine that within one generation, it would just seem fine for Israelis and Palestinians to be living together in one country where they each, have their rights. Like that just to me,
right.
like that's not scary to me. I know it feels scary to a lot of people, but I think that's not a scary thing. And I think it's very possible.
Yeah. I'll tell you, somebody just wrote something about this in the questions, but also actually, I literally spoke about this at the protests yesterday. One of the things I talked about was quoting, there's a very famous quote from Theodore Herzl when he's talking about the creation of a Jewish state, right? The Hebrew is Im tirtzu ein zo agada, right? If you will it, it is not a dream. That's his famous statement. That is like the idea of Zionism, of creating a Jewish state. When he said that, it was 1892, right? People thought that was crazy. It was totally fantastical. It was inconceivable. It was not like, it wasn't an about to happen thing, and there was no particular way to imagine that it would. And yet he and many, many, many people who eventually gathered behind that idea kept working toward that goal and ultimately achieved that goal in 1948. So one of the things that I tell all the people who say right now that peace, whether it's two states or a configuration or whatever combination, like you said, the people who live there want to see it end up in, that as difficult as that is to imagine right now, as far away as that feels to so many people when they see October 7th and settlement expansion and everything else, that it is no further away and no more fantastical than Herzl's idea was. And saying, if you will it, it was no dream. The next part of that sentence was saying, but if you don't, it will remain a dream. Like if you don't do it, it will remain a dream. And I think, that's why we do this every day. And I know for you, that's why you spend so much time with so many people who like want to see that better future for Israelis, for Palestinians, for everybody in the region.
And I think bringing it back to kind of the American context, what I think if we are ever going to be serious about this is we have to match our policies with what we say our policies are with our actual behavior. So if we say that two states is our policy, then there have to be consequences when there is continued land seizures and settlement building. And right, it's not just we've talked earlier about conditioning aid because of Gaza, but there are many ways in which we have levers that we just refuse to use them. And again, if we believe in these policies, then we should, like we would with any other country, we should say, you are doing something that is against US policy. And so we will not accept it, and we will behave differently based on your behavior, right? And our behavior never seems to change based on the behavior of the Israeli government. And I just don't understand that.
Yeah.
Like
And
the
when
message that I would get if I was the prime minister of Israel is I can do whatever I want.
I think that's clearly the message he's gotten. Look, when we first again came out with that position, it hadn't, you know, it was years ago, it had nothing to do with Gaza. It was primarily about settlement expansion and occupation. And, you know, also when we talked about the need to surge aid, food, medicine, water, um, that to me is in some ways the most remarkable, that the United States has not been willing, because it's not able, it hasn't been willing to insist on that and to
Yeah.
say, like, no, it can't be 82 trucks or 74 trucks. And I know, you know, I had the chance to meet with Jose Andres, who talked about one of the things that even those numbers of trucks is not that useful, because oftentimes now those trucks are not completely filled. They send them in a full. So the fact that the United States has been unwilling to just insist on that. And, you know, the people, I'm sure you've heard it, I hear it all the time, like, why are you pressuring Israel? Israel's a sovereign nation. They can do what they want. America can't tell them to do what they want. Put aside real politics, like, we're not even insisting that America must force Israel to do something. What we're talking about here is what America should do. And America is not required to send billions of dollars of aid or weapons or any of these other things. So yes, Israel is absolutely a sovereign nation and can and should make its decisions. But this conversation happens in this like bizarre world where it's as if the United States is not a sovereign nation. Like Israel will decide the United States has to keep doing the same thing.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm getting a little worked up. Look, we're coming to an end of our time here. We're wrapping up. I guess the last thing I want to ask you, and then, you know, add any other kind of closing comments in. We talked kind of at the beginning about the empathy deficit and how do we, you know, how do we deal with that? So I guess I would ask you, like, what do you think, what are the things that we specifically as a
Have
Jewish
an answer.
organization, as an American Jewish community, like,
Yeah.
what do you think we can be doing more to help
I have
address
an
that
answer.
question?
So look, I think I can tell you that in all of the different groups that I'm in, when we started to see those protests that were like shutting down the Brooklyn Bridge and Grand Central Station, and it was beautiful. Like we were really, the community was incredibly moved by that. Like that solidarity that has been there for the past 9 months, saying not in our name and we're with you, has been incredibly meaningful to the Arab and Muslim community. And I think one of the things that we can start to do, and anyone who is on here, Hadar can tell you how to find me, like find me. I really think it would make a difference if we start like smaller meetings within our local communities and then bringing those conversations to our members of Congress to say, like, here we are, right? The people who care about, there's been a real effort to kind of say, this is a fringe issue. Not a lot of people care about it. And I do not, I mean, I think obviously to me, it's obvious that that's not true, right? Young people care about this. Progressives care about this. The Black community cares about this. Other minority communities care about this. And so the more we could kind of have the communities that care about this and that like care deeply about this be the ones that go and have these conversations with members, I think it will start to look very different. They will start to relate to this issue very differently. They will not look at this as, oh, am I going to upset the Jewish community or the Arab American community? Well, I guess I'll pick the Jewish, right? Like it's been falsely fed to them as you have to choose between these two communities, and there may be political implications to that. I do not believe that is true. And particularly with the younger Jewish community, I just don't believe that's true. And so what we need to do is start building those coalitions within our local communities and then bringing those to our elected representatives and saying, look, all we're asking for is for a policy. It is for us to actually enact policies that match what we say we stand for. We say we stand for a rules-based order. We say we stand for a two-state solution. We say we stand for all of these things. And we need you to go to Washington and stand for those things and stand up for those things on behalf of all of the people in this room. Because that's really what we've seen the last 9 months, is that none of our communities are alone. You guys are not alone. We are not alone. And that's been, frankly, a quite pleasant surprise. But I think we need to now take that energy and mobilize it and really start having those conversations.
Yeah. All right, Rebecca, I want to thank you for joining us today and, you know, sharing your insight, sharing your views. Even more than that, I just want to thank you for, you know, always being a partner. Thank you, everybody who joined us. Again, this has been recorded. We will share it, and we look forward to seeing you all again.